So now we're going to add a header to the beginning of the buffer. This will contain information about the file we're loading. In this case, I'm going to add the name of the database, the size of the record, the entry index for amending, the version number for the save file signature, and the position to start reading the main body of the data from. This will all go into the start of the file in its own little section, and then the main data will be written afterwards. So let's start by going to our obj file object, and let's go to the create event, and down here somewhere in amongst our other variables, but before we load the file, we're going to create a database name, and we'll call that people. We're then going to create a little variable to hold the start point. Data start point equals 0. Then we're going to create a variable called save version, and we'll make that 1. Now we're going to need to draw the database name. So if we go to the draw event, just grab this top line, or actually grab that line, copy it, and just put database name in there and make it y-28. So now we're going to display the database name at the top where we can see it. We're then going to need to create a script to write our header file information in the same way that we currently have the write data script here. We're going to use a write header script just to write the header file's data. So if we go create script and call it write header, I'm going to close that, go back up to where write data was and put it in there. Drag and drop it in there so it's nice and neat and organised. There we go. So in this we're going to just put a comment at the top say write header information to the file. We're going to need to know which buffer we're using, and we'll pass that as an argument. So var buffer equals argument 0. We're then going to need to, when we read the file to access the data, I want to organise the header so that the first bytes of data are going to be the data start point number, which will tell us where the data is going to be read from. But to do that, I first need to write the data. So what I need to do is actually shift the write head position forward a couple of bytes to leave space for that variable so that I can then write the header, then get the position that we're at once we've done writing, go back to the start, and then write that position in so that when we load the file, we're reading those first couple of bytes to get the position to start reading the data from. So if we just want to access a single data entry from within the data somewhere, we don't need to read the file header. Unless we need the file header, we just read the first variable and go, that's the bit I need, that's the position I go to, I'm going to read. So we're going to do buffer seek, buffer seek start. Now the data start point is probably not going to be a huge number, so I'm not going to use a U32. I'll use a U16, which should be 2 bytes in size. So I only need to just move forward 2 bytes to create enough space for it. So we'll move forward 2 bytes by putting a 2 in there. So now we've moved the read head to start from the 3rd byte, which is byte 2, 0, 1, 2. And then we're going to write all our header data. So we just put a comment saying header data. And then we're going to go buffer write buffer, comma, and we're going to start by writing the record size, which will be buffer, that's going to be U16. What have I spelt wrong there? That was some terrible typing. Rec rod? It's not a rec rod. There we go. You can be dyslexic and write code, it's fine. You just have to go back and edit it a lot. So what we're doing here is we're writing the record size so that when you read the file, you know how far apart the records are and where to start reading each one. We're then going to mark the next entry index so that if you amend the file, you know you don't need to read the entire buffer and figure out where the end of the buffer is. You just get the buffer in memory and get this variable from the header and be like, that's where I need to write the next record to. So we're going to say buffer write buffer. This will also be a buffer U16 next entry index. We're going to want the database name, so let's write that. Buffer write buffer string database name, and we're going to want to save the version of this file, or the save file signature version, which is the variable save version. So we go buffer write buffer. We're going to make this a U8 because it's unlikely that we're going to go through so many different save signatures that will go over the top of the 255 cap that a U8 has, and write the variable save version. So now we need to figure out what the data start point is and save that. So we'll just put a data start point comment in there, and then we're going to say data start point equals buffer tell buffer. So we use buffer tell to get the current position, that the current write position, having finished writing the buffer, because that's where we're going to start, or having finished writing the header, because that's where we're going to start writing the actual data once we're writing the data. And having grabbed that, we then need to use copy this buffer seek line again and change it to 0. We're back at the start, which means this time we can write data start point. So in fact, if you grab that line there, which says buffer write buffer U16, and change that to data start point, we've now written the start position of the data into the first 2 bytes of the files itself. And having done that, that's your header script done. So now we need to insert that into the save file script. So we go over here to save file, and all we need to do is, having created the write buffer that we're writing to here, and before we actually write all our data, we put this in here, which we put a line in here just to say write header. And now our header's written, except I need to pass the write buffer as an argument. So write header, write buffer, now it's written the buffer. So now when we actually loop through our data here and write it all, we need to offset the position that we write each record to by the amount of bytes the header is, which is the data start point position. And once we're done, we need to record the next entry index afterwards. So what I'm going to do is create a little variable up here called var write point. Put that up here, and then in here we will set the write point. If I can type properly, which is data start point plus open close brackets, and it's the current position, or the position we were using, which is index times record size, offset by the data start point. That gives us the write point, and then we put that in there, So now we're setting it to each record position according to the index, offset by data start point. Having done that, we need to come out here. We need to set the next entry index position. Having saved the file, we need to also record at which position to amend it from. So I'm going to say next entry position index, get the right variable, equals, and this point it should just be the right point plus the record size. So essentially the position we just wrote, so right point, once we exit this for loop, right point will still contain, it says right buffer, right point here still contains the last position we wrote to, and the next position is just going to be that position plus the record size. So we save that as the right entry index, and that should be all you need to do to modify your save file script. Next we need to modify the load file script. So we need to essentially read the header. Now we're going to do that after we're going to read the header after we've loaded the file here. So we'll put it in between var entry and var has entries, because we need to do it before we actually read all our data, and after we've done our load, we just, somewhere in here we need to load our header. So we'll do it here, and we'll say data start point equals buffer read, and we're reading the read buffer, and we're going to read a buffer U16. So that's reading the first two bits at the start of the file, and that gives us the data start point for the data. We then need to do the same for record size. Copy that line, paste it twice, because the first three pieces of data are all U16s. Second piece goes into record size, and the third piece goes into next entry index. After this, we're going to read database name in. So buffer read buffer, and we're reading a buffer string. So that will read the database name into database name. And lastly, we're going to read in the file version. And what I'm going to do here is actually just read it into a local file, because the save file version variable that we created, we don't want to change that when we load. We're having that as a little fixed number, so that when we write, it writes this is the current version, and when we read, we check against that. So we're going to load this next variable into a local variable. So var file version equals buffer read buffer U8. So we've read that in. Now what we need to know is the version of this file less than the current save version that we're using? And we're going to do that with if file version less than save version. And if that's true, then in here we need to use the previous loading signature. Else we need to use the new loading or the current loading signature, which is basically all of this stuff to here. So go down and put a squiggly bracket before buffer delete, and then select the rest of it and indent it. Oomph. So we should, If I just click on next to that left squiggly bracket, highlight it, it should highlight that one, and if I click next to there, highlights that one. So what we're now saying is, if the version if we're loading, say, a version 1 file, a file that's written in version 1, and we've now updated to version 2, then that's less, so we need to load the previous signature. Now you could essentially you'll want to copy all of this, put it in a script, etc. However, because the I'm going to skip that part because it'll just be lots of copying and pasting and faffing around, and because at this point we actually, because we've created it using a file header now, all the previous file data we created won't be able to load anyway unless you put the file header inside its own separate thing and stuff like that. Which we're going to skip over that because we don't really need to do that at the moment. For the sake of this tutorial, it's lots of extra faffing and code that's just not really necessary. All you need to know is that how to do this check, and then you just put your old loading code in here as a script. So let's actually modify this new code to take into account the data start point. So to do that, we need to modify this line, which tells us where to load the entry from, where it tells buffer seek where to start reading from. And to do that, we just need to, at the start here, put data start point plus open brackets and go to the end, close brackets. So you bracket these off, multiply those together, add them to start point, and start point offsets it. And now that will quite happily load the data according to the record size after the header's been written or read. Now we just need to change the amend file and the overwrite. Start with the amend. So all we need to do in here is now if the file exists, it's going to still load it in the same way, and buffer seek will read to the next entry index. So that doesn't need to change, that's fine. So in here where we have created the new buffer, we actually want to write the header information to that buffer before we then start amending. So we'll just go write header amend buffer, and then set the next entry index to the data start point, because no data has actually been written, so it's the first point, which is the data start point. Now the rest of our amend code should work fine. We just need to make a little change to the overwrite, and what we need to do there is the same offsetting that we've done before, where we bracket this off, go to the beginning and say data start point plus. So now we've offset where we overwrite an entry to. Now because the current set of data that we've been loading and saving to in the previous videos doesn't have a header and won't be able to load it without it, won't be able to load the file correctly, we're going to create a new file. So I'm just going to go over to create and just change file num. So change it to another number or a letter or any valid character. Then we should be able to save it and run it. So I'm going to hit space a few times, creating some people. I'm going to hit enter on Sarah Smith, overwrite her, everything's working fine. If I then hit reload, you can see all the same people. Now I'm going to show you a neat little trick, and this is how we're going to check that the headers demonstrate that the header is actually writing correctly. If you click back on your workspace while it's still running, and if we just say, if I go to step, put a breakpoint in the if, it should hit it straight away. Here we go. We're in the debugger. We're going to go over here to these variables, open up self. Within here we have the database name variable. If I double click in here, we can edit the contents of this variable, and I'm going to change that to from people to friends. Then take the breakpoint off, click run. You see it now says friends there. And if I hit F1 to save it, and then hit reload, you'll see it still says friends. Now, having reset it, having gone through the create, it will have set database name back to people. Which means the only way it could now say friends is if it's loaded from the header of the file. So yeah, that should be enough data loading, saving and manipulating. There's one last thing I'm going to show you in the next video, which is how to create a different object that just accesses the data by loading the buffer and pulling out a specific entry by its index. This will effectively this is going to mimic the kind of the tool to game relationship, as effectively what we're doing here with this is effectively the kind of the tool where it's creating the data. And next I'll show you how to create a little accessing object which actually targets and loads specific bits of the data that it needs. So yeah, that should be a little card in the top left that you can click on. Top right, clicky clicky. See you in a bit.